Hello. Today, I will be discussing the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, focusing on how the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek continues to shape the nation's sovereignty through its modern government and tribal court system. The central idea of this presentation is that sovereignty is not only a historical concept preserved in treaties, but sovereignty is exercised through institutions: a constitution, elected leaders, a legislative body, courts, police, prosecutors, and cultural practices that serve the Choctaw Nation's people. The Choctaw people lived throughout what is now Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana long before the United States existed. Professor Smith emphasizes that anyone studying a tribal court must first study the history of that tribe, because each tribal government and court system reflects the tribe's own political and cultural development. The Choctaw Nation's history includes ancient community life, diplomacy with European and American governments, treaty making, forced removal, and rebuilding in Indian Territory. This history matters because the modern court system cannot be separated from the nation's long struggle to preserve self government. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek was signed September 27, 1830, and proclaimed in 1831. It is understood as the first major removal treaty carried out under the federal policy of Indian removal. The treaty involved in the secession of Choctaw lands east of the Mississippi and relocation to Indian Territory. However, for this presentation, the treaty is also important because it reflects a government to government relationship. The United States negotiated with the Choctaw Nation as a political community, which is evidence of external sovereignty. Removal changed the Choctaw Nation's geography, but it did not erase the nation's inherent authority to govern itself. Professor Smith distinguishes internal sovereignty from external sovereignty. External sovereignty is recognition by other sovereigns, including recognition of a tribe's political status, territory, and government to government relationship. Internal sovereignty refers to what a government does for its own people, for and over its own people, such as holding elections, legislation, operating courts, regulating membership, and maintaining public safety. The Choctaw Nation demonstrates both. The treaty relationship with the United States reflects external sovereignty. The Constitutional, the Tribal Council, courts, lighthouse police, and membership roles reflect internal sovereignty. This timeline shows that Choctaw sovereignty did not begin with the modern Constitution. The Choctaw Nation existed as a political community before the United States. It entered treaties with the United States, endured a removal, rebuilt itself in Indian Territory, and later organized its modern constitutional government. The 1983 Constitution organizes the exercise of sovereignty, but it does not create that sovereignty. The authority is inherent, and the modern government gives that authority structure. The Choctaw Nation is governed under a constitution structure with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The chief is elected and exercises executive authority. The tribal council is made up of 12 elected members and exercises legislative authority. Judicial members are appointed, and the judicial branch oversees the Choctaw Nation court system. This structure demonstrates internal sovereignty because the nation defines its own institutions, separates governmental powers, and governs through its own constitutional framework. The preamble to the Choctaw Constitution is one of the most important primary sources in this presentation. It states that the Constitution is established pursuant to the inherent tribal sovereignty of the Choctaw Nation. That language matters because it shows the source of authority is not simply delegation from the federal government. The Constitution organizes authority that already belongs to the Choctaw Nation as a sovereign tribal government. Historically, the Bureau of Indian Affairs played a major supervisory role in tribal government affairs. Professor Smith explains that the Court of Indian Offenses developed through federal regulations in the BIA administration. Those courts were not the same as modern constitutional courts. The Choctaw Nation's modern government reflects a shift toward self determination. Federal approval and government to government relations still matter in federal law, but the nation's constitution, courts, and institutions represent self government rather than a mere federal administration. The Choctaw Judicial Branch describes its work as ensuring access to justice and honoring tradition. The court system includes district court, appellate court, constitutional court, tribal codes, case recordings, e-filing, diversion programs, public defender, prosecutor, and criminal justice functions. This is a modern court system, but it remains grounded in Choctaw sovereignty and tribal law. The judicial branch gives the nation the ability to interpret and enforce its own laws rather than depending entirely on state or federal courts. The Choctaw Constitution vests judicial authority in the tribal court and gives the court authority to decide disputes arising under the Constitution and rules or regulations enacted by the tribal council. Later, Choctaw legislation further develops the structure of the court system, including district and appellate functions. For that reason, the court is both constitutional and council supported, constitutional in its source of authority, and further shaped by tribal legislation and code. The Choctaw Judicial Branch currently identifies court locations in Tallahena, Durant, and McAllister. The McAllister Judicial Center opened in 2026 to improve access to justice for residents in the northern counties of the reservation. The Choctaw Nation explains that the new facility helps reduce congestion in Durant and brings together probation services, public defenders, and prosecutors. Physical access matters because sovereignty is not meaningful if citizens cannot realistically reach the institutions that protect their rights and resolve disputes. A court system depends on the people who make it function. Judges interpret and apply Choctaw law. Clerks maintain records, filings, and access to the court. Administrators support the operation of the judicial branch. Prosecutors, public defenders, and bar members help ensure due process and meaningful participation in the system. The Choctaw Code requires judges to meet legal qualifications and be appointed by the chief and confirmed by the tribal council. These roles make the court a functioning branch of government rather than merely a concept in the Constitution. The Choctaw District Court hears family matters such as divorce, child custody, child support, parental rights, visitation, and adoption. It also hears civil matters, juvenile matters, and guardianship. The broader court system includes criminal cases, marriage and adoption records, diversion programs, and healing to wellness court. These types of cases show that internal sovereignty affects daily life. The court system is not an abstract. It touches families, children, public safety, civil disputes, and community wellness. Appellate review is important because it strengthens fairness, consistency, and confidence in the court system. The Choctaw Judicial Branch includes an appellate and constitutional court. The Constitutional Court is the ultimate decision maker in disputes concerning the Choctaw Constitution, electoral appeals, tribal council rules and regulations, and matters brought from the court of general jurisdiction. This means that the nation has its own mechanisms for interpreting its own law and correcting legal error. The Choctaw Nation Bar Association licenses its members to practice before all courts of the Choctaw Nation. Its materials identify requirements such as good moral character, due respect for the law, fitness to practice, being at least 18 years old, and being admitted to practice before the highest court of a state or otherwise qualified under the rules. A tribal bar is important because it protects the integrity of the court and reminds practitioners that they are appearing in a sovereign tribal forum. The Choctaw Nation Department of Public Safety safeguards citizens and non-citizens who reside in the reservation and patrols more than 10,000 square miles through multiple departments. The Light Horse Police are part of that public safety structure. The Tribal Prosecutor's Office represents the Choctaw Nation in criminal, juvenile, de- delinquent matters. The police and prosecutors demonstrate that sovereignty includes not only making laws, but also enforcing them and pursuing justice through the nation's own institutions. Professor Smith's history of tribal courts explains that before modern court structures, many tribes used councils, chiefs, peacemakers, and community based dispute resolutions. Professor Smith uses ex parte crow dog to illustrate a restorative approach aimed at restoring balance in the community rather than simply punishing an individual. The Choctaw District Court states that it strives to incorporate traditional values into the judicial system, provided individualized, personal solutions. That connection between tradition and modern due process is a powerful expression of tribal sovereignty. This is the central answer to the assignment. Tribal courts matter because they are one of the clearest modern expressions of sovereignty. Without a tribal court, the nation would depend much more heavily on the outside governments to interpret the law, resolve disputes, and administer justice. Through its courts, the Choctaw Nation protects its self government, treaty rights, cultural values, families, and the rule of law. Tribal courts are not simply legal institutions, they're institutions of self determination. The Choctaw Nation's history demonstrates that sovereignty is not simply a historical concept preserved in treaties. It is exercised every day through the nation's constitution, elected government, judicial branch, public safety system, and cultural commitments. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek is part of that story because of how it reflects the Choctaw Nation's political relationship with the United States. The modern tribal court system shows how sovereignty continues in practice. The Choctaw Nation is not a historical subject.